Hello, everybody. Welcome and good morning. Welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. Today's session is going to be called The Irony of Fate, which is also going to be on the relationship between contingency and necessity within the Hegelian ontology. If you're new here, welcome. This is a weekly Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture that I've been hosting for, I suppose, 3 years by now, which is remarkable. I love doing it, so I'm so grateful that you're here with me on this chilly, cold morning. Please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. I see, let's see, I see some comments, but no locations yet. I am currently visiting my in-laws in Spokane, Washington, which is also where I keep all of my books. So it's very nice to be here over the holidays. And last week was my birthday. I am now 35 years old, which feels wonderful. I feel very blessed to have made it this far. I see someone from India. Hello, India. I see Germany. Good morning. I'd also like to say that if you'd like to download these lectures as audio files, as well as their transcripts, or if you'd like to download my ebook, you can find that all on my Patreon. A huge thanks to the patrons who keep this project going. You can find all that and more by going to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. And I see that Jenlene is coming in. Do you want to say hello on camera? No? Okay. Jenlene is in the corner. Jenlene was bringing me some slippers because it is a very, very cold morning indeed. So I'm glad to have some slippers. That's very kind. It's very thoughtful. For those of you commenting on my hair, I have, in fact, just woken up. So this is what my hair looks like. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of things. But essentially it's supposed to be an introduction to some philosophical and theoretical concepts in a way that's hopefully accessible without dumbing down the complexity. That has always been the goal, to retain the complexity, but to nevertheless make it accessible. So let's begin. Make yourself comfortable. We're going to be here for a little while. There's a Russian film. This is where I want to begin. There's a Russian film called The Irony of Fate. And in this film, a young man who's about to be married drinks too much at a celebration party for New Year's Eve and accidentally boards a flight to Leningrad instead of staying in Moscow, where he lives. And once he arrives in Leningrad, he goes to what he believes to be his apartment, which is, the exact same generic apartment block on Worker Street, so-and-so, apartment 15. And in a drunken stupor, he enters into what he believes to be his apartment and falls asleep. Now, of course, this is not his apartment. This is, in fact, somebody else's apartment, a young woman who is expecting her lover. And so what appears to be a commedia dell'arte, essentially a comedy of mistaken identity, turns into something else. They clash. She, of course, is horrified to discover that there's a strange man lying in her bed. Her partner, who suspects something, abruptly leaves her, and vice versa. The partner of the man who finds himself in the wrong apartment, his partner leaves him as well. And these two strangers find themselves on New Year's Eve, thrown together under erroneous circumstances in this apartment. And of course, the film has a happy ending. The disaster turns out to be a meet cute, and they become a couple. These two strangers who had never met before become a couple. Hence why the movie is called The Irony of Fate. The irony of fate here being that two strangers met under impossible circumstances on New Year's Eve and were therefore, quote unquote, fated to become lovers. I was sort of curious to learn that this is a film that is actually a part of a New Year's Eve tradition in Russia, that it was broadcast during the Soviet Union and that people still continue to watch it today. Now, In this movie, we can identify all the central themes of Hegel's critique of contingency and necessity. But let's begin with the film once more. The underlying critique, or joke, if you will, in the film, The Irony of Fate, is that in the Soviet Union, every apartment looks the same. And that therefore, fundamentally, you could walk into somebody else's apartment in Leningrad and think that it were your own apartment in Moscow. In fact, part of what contributes to this illusion, which has a nightmarish component, is that the man thinks that he recognizes his own furniture in the apartment. And then it turns out that they simply own the same kind of furniture. They lead the same kind of lives. However, this isn't necessarily a critique of the Soviet Union. Otherwise, it wouldn't be broadcast on the central government station, and it wouldn't become such a classic. Instead, it actually fits completely within the ideological message of the Soviet Union, which is that it's precisely against the backdrop of the supposed, if you will, blandness of civic bourgeois life that the true miracles of fate can occur. In fact, the slogan to the movie is, "Only under these circumstances could fate have taken place," which is another way of saying that it's precisely in these bleak circumstances in which apartment blocks upon apartment blocks are repeated, in which the lives fundamentally mirror each other. In fact, even the commodities in the apartment signal a kind of social unity. It's precisely against this bland backdrop that the miracle of love, the irony of fate, occurs. In fact, the film has a somewhat curious subtitle, which is "Enjoy Your Bath." And I thought a little bit more about what this means, and essentially, I take it as follows. In the film, the mistake that the man makes is that he allows himself to celebrate a tradition, which is to his friends to a public bath and to start drinking. And because he is drunk, he boards the wrong plane to St. Leningrad. What therefore appears to be a mistake turns out to be the very key, the very catalyst of his success. And the slogan, "Enjoy your bath," should therefore be taken almost as a Kantian maxim as to the necessity of fate, which is to say, do the thing that appears to you at first as a mistake, which will nevertheless retroactively appear to you as the most important thing you ever did. In other words, the contingent situation by which the man becomes too drunk at a public bath and then boards the wrong plane and ends up in the wrong apartment and falls in love with the wrong woman is not in fact a mistake, but is in fact the unfolding of a higher necessity. Now, to pivot briefly to philosophy, usually the relationship between contingency, in other words, accident, and necessity, or fate, is actually a reframing, an existential one, if you will, of the classic binary, the classic ontological binary of essence versus appearance. In other words, that you have the higher, the absolute or the divine, namely essence or pure form for Plato, and then you have the world of appearances, objects in the world, which, seen through the lens of traditional pre-Hegelian ontology, are therefore lesser than the ideal. Whereas contingency and necessity follows this fundamental pattern, which is to say that the necessary is the ideal. It's the preordained, if you will. Whereas the contingent, the accidental, is the merely mortal, the thing that happens through objects coming into contact with each other. In other words, traditionally, at least before Hegel, from an ontological perspective, necessity was equated with essence, and contingency, accident, was equated with appearance. In other words, we have a moral binary, if you will, between the higher essence or necessity and the lower form of appearance or contingency. Now, it's actually interesting here, before I go to Hegel, it's interesting here because one can make a leap to Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard writes that philosophy can essentially be seen as a battle between Socrates and Christ. In fact, I feel like that's what I should have as the thumbnail for this video, Socrates versus Christ. I feel like that would be very eye-catching. But why does Kierkegaard write that philosophy and ontology is Socrates versus Christ? Well, essentially, he's making the same argument that I was just making, which is to say that the traditional Socratic ontology is a binary between the necessity of the higher, of essence, and the contingency, the mere contingency, right? You can already see a kind of hint of disdain here, the mere contingency of the appearance of objects and their forms. Whereas Christ is the oh so normal, oh so human, if you will, quote unquote, vulgar embodiment of the highest, of God, of the absolute, the ideal. In fact, this is something that you'll find in Slavoj Žižek's writing when he refers to the monstrosity of Christ. And he's also referring here to G.K. Chesterton, sorry. The monstrosity of Christ is precisely that the highest appears in what is supposed to be the lowest, namely mortal man, that the infinite makes itself manifest in the seemingly contingent appearance of mortal being. In fact, this is why Slavoj Žižek, and not just Slavoj Žižek, is a theological argument, has argued that the resurrection of Christ isn't an event that occurs after the crucifixion. It's something that occurs within the crucifixion as such. In other words, the quote-unquote fall of God, by which the eternal essence of God is made manifest through a finite subject, a mortal body, is the exact dialectical moment of the arising, the transcendence, if you will, of the community of the faithful made manifest in Christ. Therefore, Christ is this dialectical, chiasmic ex-figure who represents this Aufhebung, to put it in Hegelian terms, this moment which is both a lifting up and a retaining. And Frederick Jameson, for example, the American literary theorist, has pointed out that even within speech, when we talk about the sublime, we often have this curious inversion where instead of talking about the magnitude of our love or our loyalty, we'll say the depths of our love or the depths of our loyalty. That therefore, altitudo can be both the highest and the lowest. It's precisely the sublime marker by which the highest becomes the lowest and the lowest becomes the highest. Now, to return here to Kierkegaard, we can see here what Kierkegaard means about Christ versus Socrates. If the Socratic binary is the one by which we have a strict division between the highest and the lowest, between essence and appearance, then Christ becomes the antithesis to this. Christ is the embodiment of the highest as the lowest, God as mere mortal. But vice versa, the unfolding of, if you will, the contingency of necessity by which God falls into the higher form of the Trinity. In fact, this is really important if you want to understand the Hegelian ontology, which is often characterized as being post-metaphysical. It's post-metaphysical in this religious sense. Hegel is a very Christian thinker. I think that's something that's often underemphasized, which is to say, Hegel's argument of substance as subject, Hegel's famous ontology, the bringing together of essence and appearance into one, is essentially an argument about Christ on the cross. It mirrors the same logic. But Hegel doesn't see in Christ on the cross a moral narrative. Instead, he sees an ontological logic proposition, a logical proposition about the highest and the lowest, about necessity and contingency. Now, Kierkegaard is actually someone who is super interested in general in this idea of paradoxes, if you will, the relationship between the finite and the infinite. There's a great sequence, it's fairly well known, from Kierkegaard's Sickness unto Death, where Kierkegaard essentially posits that what human beings are afraid of isn't necessarily that they are mortal. In other words, the true fear isn't that they're finite. The true fear is that they are immortal, that they are infinite. Now, ironically, and I'll explain in a moment why Kierkegaard argues this, ironically, I've seen on the internet that this Kierkegaardian idea has been translated into a contemporary self-help maxim that has a very different logic, which is, I think, and I think it goes like this. The true fear is not that we will fail. The true fear is that we will succeed, or some more poetic version of it being that our greatest fear is not how weak we are. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful without measure, or something like this, which is a self-help maxim that derives from this Kierkegaardian argument. However, when Kierkegaard argues that what you're afraid of is not being mortal or finite, but rather being immortal, is that he says that the idea of an immortal soul, whether it's the idea of an eternal afterlife, or heaven or hell, or perhaps even the more secular contemporary idea of wanting to be remembered after you pass away, that these specters of your non-existence haunt you in the present, that they're the things we really feel. In other words, if we simply were able to embrace our finitude, to live an almost animalesque existence without the awareness of death, we would be perfectly fine. However, according to Kierkegaard, if we could live under the auspices of a death that is final, we would also be fine. In other words, what frightens us is not the prospect of death, of not existing. What frightens us, according to Kierkegaard, is that something of us would continue to exist, whether it's the family or the money we leave behind, whether it's the work we want to leave behind that others will remember, whether it's the houses we want to build, our legacy, etc. A distinctly bourgeois notion, of course. Or whether it's the afterlife, the idea that what we do in the world from a Protestant perspective would be all work that is done to reveal to us whether or not we are one of the chosen ones who are the elect who go to heaven. In fact, here we can see one of the differences between the Catholic logic, if you will, and the Protestant one. The Catholic logic essentially posits that the world as it exists is an opportunity for redemption. However, redemption only occurs if you have gone through the error of sin. This is always what has been mildly threatening about Catholicism to Protestantism. Also why G.K. Chesterton argued that underneath the iron facade or the armor of Catholicism lies an abundance of jouissance and pleasure. Which is to say, redemption only occurs after the fall. It's like you have to sin in order to be redeemed. And of course, the way in which the church gets around this problem, which therefore almost seems like a prohibition that encourages the very things it's supposed to forbid, is to say, well, life is universally sinful. Everyone sins all the time. And yet, the more dangerous subversive notion here is that it almost encourages you to sin, to partake in life, to experience life, and therefore to afterwards be redeemed, to beg for forgiveness. Hence the importance of having a priest at the end of your life, especially if you've led a hedonistic, sinful life. Whereas the Protestant logic is that, strictly speaking, it's already been determined whether or not you are a good or a bad person, whether or not you are supposed to be saved. And yet the irony is that this fact is unbeknownst to you and will be revealed in the process of your life. In other words, your very actions are supposed to retroactively reveal the necessity of what was already your fate, what was predetermined. Therefore, in a sense, now you're stuck in a properly Kantian bind, which is to say, now you're stuck having to act as if this were your highest duty realized as your freedom, which is to say, I'm doing good works because I know that I was already a priori chosen to be a good person. And of course, this leads us to the contemporary ideological obfuscation by which people who don't, quote unquote, succeed in life simply have themselves to blame because they didn't work hard enough, didn't pull themselves up by their bootstraps, etc. It's part of why Max Weber famously argued that that there's a connection between the spirit of Protestantism and the spirit of capitalism. The realization of Protestantism in its highest universal form, therefore being the ethical framework that underlines capitalist production, which therefore is the reproduction of the subject who facilitates the reproduction of capitalist reproduction, as it were. Now, once again, we're really talking about necessity versus contingency, which is another way of saying we're talking about fate versus accident. And the Hegelian argument can be simplified into being the following. There is no distinction between fate and accident. In fact, fate is simply the realization of the higher form of accident. In other words, the necessity of contingency as such. But as per usual with Hegel, the simplified version tells us very little. In fact, one of the beauties, and I think joys of studying Hegel, is that the more you try to simplify Hegel, the more difficult he seems. This is sort of the whole point for Hegel, that he invites you to go through the whole argument with him. So what is the argument? Well, the argument is essentially that the universal can only appear through its particular exception, in the same way that necessity only appears through what appears to be its singular exception, namely accident, its antithesis. Subjectivity, for example, would be the ultimate instance of this universal singular. After all, the subject, from a Cartesian perspective, in its very essence and its very identity, is singular. I think, therefore I am, which from a Cartesian perspective is therefore I doubt, therefore I am. And doubting is predicated upon difference, resistance to the universal. I am a singular being. I am different from everybody else. And yet it's only in this particularity of the subject that A, the universal can be contemplated in the first place. This is Kant's famous dilemma, right? How is it that pure reason is itself a concept? Can it therefore still be considered pure? Hence the critique of pure reason. But B, for Hegel, what if the universal therefore only exists in its supposed deviation, namely the particular gaze or stance through which the universal is conceptualized? Therefore, the fall for Hegel from the supposed ideal space of the absolute into the non-ideal space of the subject is therefore not so much a geographical fall by which one goes from the higher to the lower, but a dialectical fall that occurs within the subject as such. That subjectivity is precisely the singular universal by which universality is realized through its own recognition through subjectivity. I'll give you an example of this, sort of a, not the perfect example, but a relatable one. I was at the gym yesterday. I was at my local YMCA. And the gym always has these wonderful slogans that it puts up on the whiteboard, usually motivational slogans of some kind. And this time, it was a variation on the Wildian maxim that you might as well be yourself because everybody else is already taken. Except it was sort of vulgarized into a simpler slogan, which was, be yourself. That is your superpower. Okay, not quite as good as Oscar Wilde, but I'll take it. But this is, of course, another example on an ideological level of the Hegelian argument about universal versus particular, which is to say, one of the most common universal experiences today is going to the gym, taking care of your health, creating yourself as a fit, productive individual who can thrive and succeed within contemporary capitalist life. And yet, fundamentally, every person at the gym conceives of themselves as a particular entity, as someone who is there with their own individual life, their goals, etc. In other words, everyone's fundamentally doing the same thing, and yet recreating this universal level of participation on the auspices of doing it on an individual private level. It's why in the gym, at least here, people don't really talk to each other. They put their earbuds in, and it's like they're desperately very concentrated. They're very focused on being in their own little world. Now, please don't take this as a condemnation of this fact. I'm just simply sort of observing it, because it leads me to a secondary point, which is that from a Hegelian perspective, this is how all universality functions, which is that the universal can't be accessed directly. It can only be accessed indirectly through this individual particular participation, which is to say, every subject, every person is going through the world, seeing the world through their eyes, their experience, and even if it's framed through what Hegel would call an abstract universal, through your gender, through your age, through your nationality, etc., multiple other layers of identity that shape the way in which you view the world, the concrete universal is precisely the backdrop, the horizon against which all these other quote-unquote lower forms of universality can take shape. And yet the very argument about higher and lower is misleading here. Because for Hegel, this abstract universality is necessary for the emergence of the concrete one. In other words, the concrete one doesn't stand against the abstract universality, it lies within it. That to be an individual in the world only takes place against the backdrop of abstract forms of universal identity, and that this abstract universal itself only takes place against the backdrop of concrete universality. It's possible here that I'm mixing up abstract and concrete. I may have to go back and take a look at it. Anyway, this argument, nevertheless, still functions on the level of accident versus fate, which is to say, if the particular is accidental, namely who you are, where you were born, etc., then it nevertheless appears to you retroactively as a necessity. After all, how else could it appear to you? It's not like you could imagine, I mean, you could imagine, but it's not like you could live being born in another time, in another place, etc. And so strictly speaking, the conditions under which you lead your life are contingent, but they have to be retroactively accepted as necessity. And this Hegelian / Kierkegaardian idea about freedom, therefore freedom being the necessity of embracing your own fate, like Kierkegaard, who famously said that anxiety is simply the dizziness of freedom, is a Kantian position. For Kant, freedom wasn't this ideological thing that you were supposed to protect, like, protect your freedom, etc. Instead, for Kant, freedom was an abyss. Freedom, in its pure universal substance, was something that was like a void that you could fall into. That fundamentally, to enact your freedom, to act upon your freedom, turn it into something, therefore meant to restrict yourself. It's like G.K. Chesterton, who wrote that every act of will is an act of self-limitation. Fundamentally, therefore, freedom is like this universal abyss, this backdrop against which the possibility of the recognition as to your own necessity occurs. And therefore, you can choose to act. In fact, for Kant, the famous maxim is du kannst, denn du sollst, which I've mentioned before. You can because you must. That freedom is the realization of a higher necessity, that you feel as if you had no other choice but to act. And when faced with the opposite of this, with the opportunity to do everything or to do anything without any kind of ethical horizon or purpose, we find ourselves in the Kierkegaardian anxiety being the dizziness of freedom. Now, to make a massive leap forward, it's from this perspective that you can begin to understand Lacan's famous maxim that your anxiety is telling you the truth. Namely, the anxiety of freedom, to put it in Kierkegaardian terms, is precisely the anxiety that what appears to you as freedom is in fact none other than the flip side of the coin, which is the result of a self-imposed limitation. In other words, duty. I must do this is therefore the principal act of freedom, rather than I could do anything. I hope that makes sense. To simplify it in extremely simplified terms, if you want to authentically act in a way that is free, it means that you have to choose to do something. You have to choose to dedicate yourself to something. It's like, I don't know, to quote Drake in one of his older albums, he said, "Last night I decided that I was willing to die for it, just so that I could feel alive for it." This is Drake essentially quoting Kant and Kierkegaard. It's only when you've identified the thing that you believe you could die for that you start living for something, essentially. That freedom isn't the possibility of doing anything and therefore being free of consequences. Freedom is precisely assuming responsibility and doing something that you see as being a higher necessity. Now, to start wrapping things up a little bit here, and thank you for listening, if you've stuck with me so far. I mentioned briefly that Hegel argues that the subject is the site of this dialectical contradiction of contingency and necessity, substance as subject. And this is where I want to briefly return to the Hegelian concept of the night of the world, die Nacht des, but also die Nacht im, the night of man and the night in man. Now, what's curious when you go back to this passage in Hegel's Jena Realphilosophie is that he therefore equates the world with man. But he equates the universal horizon of being with the inner, if you will, stage upon which subjectivity is made manifest. And Hegel's argument in The Night of the World is that subjectivity, therefore, emerges precisely against the backdrop of the realization of the emptiness, the void, the night, if you will, of this universal horizon of possibility, which is existence. It's similar, to go back to the movie Irony of Fate, right? It's only within these apartment blocks that mirror themselves over and over in a kind of horrific image of reproduction, of social reproduction. It's only against the backdrop of this night of the world that something as miraculous as the event of true love. In fact, of course, in The Irony of Fate, being a Soviet film, even though it's a product of mass entertainment, there is an undercurrent of ideological critique against the bourgeois affectation by which you would identify through buying certain products. It's like you walk into an apartment today and everyone immediately signifies who they are. It's like, tell me what you buy on Amazon and I will tell you who you are, which is of course the very principle underlying the algorithm, right? Which is that you could sell this knowledge to advertisers who would then sell it back to you. Thus the loop closes itself like some massive commercial Ouroboros. And within the irony of fate, we have what appears to be a night of the world, what appears to be a dystopia. In fact, the movie opens with a animated montage of a classical apartment being created. Like you could see a classic apartment and it has like Doric and Ionian fake neoclassical columns on it, big windows, etc. And then the architect shows up and he sort of blares his horn and the pillars fall off it, the roof falls off it. Everything is stripped of these excessive forms until we end up with a brutalist apartment block that simply looks like this. And then it's replicated over and over and over and over again. And what's so strange about watching this film is that you look at this and you think, well, that's a dystopia, right? Everybody living in little boxes. It's like the critique, the famous opening song to the television series Weeds, which was a critique and a satire of suburban domestic disaffection in the United States. Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes filled with ticky-tacks, little boxes, etc. These little boxes start the movie The Irony of Fate. We have this reproduction of this infinite horizon of apartment blocks that look exactly the same. And yet, interestingly enough, as the movie unfolds, the argument is that this night of the world, in which subjectivity is stripped of all its particular manifestations, it's only against this horizon of pure contingency, if you will, that the necessity of a higher love between two people can unfold. And of course, the ideological machination of the plot is that this is staged against the backdrop of New Year's Eve. In other words, the slogan for the movie, "It could have only happened on this night," could be rephrased as, "It could only have happened in the Soviet Union." The ideological undercurrent, therefore, is that what appears to others as the bland space of Soviet domesticity is in fact the night of the world, the horizon upon which the higher joys, the thrills of pure true love and necessity are staged. All deeply ideological, of course, and yet nevertheless interesting. But for Hegel, this night of the world, in which the subject loses itself in order to, if you will, find itself or find the formal truth of its relationship to the universal, is therefore something horrific. It's like why Hegel, and then you can even find traces of this within Wittgenstein, would idealize the idea of warfare, the idea of being in the military, because one of the first things that happens within the military is that you're stripped of your particular civic identity. You're made to wear a uniform, you're made to follow orders, uh, uh, you act in a completely different, according to an incentive structure than you would if you were an individual walking through the world. And Wittgenstein, who left his studies to participate in the war, had the same idea that there was some truth to be found in this abyss, as it were, which, to be clear here, is completely different from the fascist argument that it is only within war that we find our higher selves, that morality is restored, that heroism and the heroic character of the people can only be found when it is tested against hardship, that a person becomes weak without struggle and battle, etc. These are distinctly not the arguments that Hegel and Wittgenstein have in mind. These would be a vulgarization of Nietzschean principles. Instead, the argument is that this fall into this loss of subjectivity, of identity, contains the formal truth as to the empty abyss, or what Lacan would call the real, that lies within subjectivity as such. That it holds on to something which isn't really there, that it grounds itself in the other, which grounds itself in the marker of an absolute experience. Fundamentally, of course, there is no truth to be had in this abyss other than the truth of the form of the abyss. For example, if you simply dive into a nihilist perspective, which is to say, why would anything make me be something, like the nothing matters slogan, is actually weirdly comforting. It's an escape, right? This is something that Kierkegaard argues as well. Kierkegaard argues that it's much more comforting to think of yourself as a mere speck of dust against the horizon of infinite expanse in the universe than it is to actually embrace the fact that you are an individual with responsibilities who has to do something and make something of yourself in your life. In fact, I saw a very tragic version of this that I think should prove the comfort of what Kierkegaard argues. I saw online recently a young woman who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness who posted something on the internet where she said that what was comforting to her was that we're all but specks of dust in an infinite universe, and that we've been given the gift of existence, which is certainly true, right? It's very heartfelt. It's a comforting notion. And this is exactly what Kierkegaard has in mind when he says that it's comforting to think of ourselves as tiny specks of dust in an infinite expanse of nothingness. What's much more terrifying is precisely the realization that we are a universe unto ourselves with responsibilities, and that we want to make something of ourselves. What frightens us more is not our limitations. What frightens us is our possibility. Now, I realize that we're sort of getting off topic here, but I'm trying to bring it back onto the point. Hegel's argument with the night of the world is therefore that what happens in the night of the world is that the subject is stripped of all the handholds, if you will, of particular orientation. So for example, if being a member of the family would be one, being a member of a tribe or a religion or, I don't know, a branding identity. Today, people identify whether or not they have Stanley Cups or buy Macs or Microsoft, right? Strip all of this away, and you're left with an abyss, the night of the world, in which subjectivity, therefore, cannot sustain itself, because subjectivity needs these markers, needs these abstract universals. And Hegel's argument, therefore, is that there's no truth in this abyss. The night of the world is not a location of truth, but the form of the abyss contains the truth as to the relationship of the subject to substance, to the universal, which is that universality can only be staged in the subject and vice versa. Now, to reiterate here, this is fundamentally what happens with the realization of one's own necessity, with the idea of fate. Think about love, for example, which is a very important example for Hegel. More than just a metaphor, it's actually a key component of Hegel's argument. Love is something completely universal. Everyone wants to love and be loved, and it's necessary, I would say, for the continuation of existence. Which is also why, I'm going off topic here, which is also why it's so dangerous when people try to simply turn love into another chemical component that occurs in your brain, this stance that tries to turn what are very complicated relationships and experiences into simply yet another thing that can be quantified and properly medicated. For Alain Badiou, for example, the French philosopher, this is this instinct, this tendency to try to quantify experiences. For example, depression is simply not having sufficient chemical balance in your brain, etc. This emphasis on productivity and efficiency is precisely one of the ideological mystifications that go along with late-stage capitalism. The creation of an ideally functioning subject who could be healed or cured so as to participate more seamlessly or integrate more seamlessly into the web of capitalist reproduction. Whereas one could argue, not to romanticize mental health conditions, of course, that the subject is torn, the subject is split, the subject is barred. The futility of life is precisely one of the central necessities of life. It's like the well-known passage, the absurdist passage in Camus, that Sisyphus is not happy, but we must consider Sisyphus happy, which is a difference. To say that Sisyphus is happy is simply to put a label on him, an emoji, like thumbs up. To say we must imagine Sisyphus happy is that the acceptance and the realization of one's fate, similar to Nietzsche's idea of amor fati, is precisely the embrace of subjectivity in its truth, which is a form of ethical happiness. Not happiness as being the absence of pain, the absence of suffering, but happiness as the embrace, the subjective embrace of one's own predicament, which is of course the predicament of subjectivity as such. But anyway, I'm getting off topic here, I apologize. The point, therefore, is that for Hegel, subjectivity and the truth of subjectivity is therefore a replica, if you will, of a higher truth, which is the non-relationship or the dialectical relationship between essence and appearance. If in the same way that appearance isn't simply a mere lower form of the higher that has to be overcome, in other words, the Socratic logic, according to Kierkegaard, then the subject follows the quote-unquote Christian logic, again, according to Kierkegaard, who has this quote that I said, that it's about Socrates versus Christ, that human beings' subjectivity in its ordinary form is hilariously contingent, like trivial even. And yet it's this triviality that creates the stage and the foundation for the emergence of the highest experience, which is to love and be loved, to continue the cycle of life. And this is where I left off, which is to say that love is an important metaphor for Hegel, because Hegel sees in love this precise interrelationship of contingency and necessity. Every person who falls in love believes that they're the first person to do so. I came across a beautiful rendition of this. I can't remember who it was. I think it was I think it's Victor Hugo, actually, who writes about this, that love, but I'd have to check, that every person who loves believes that they're the first person to have ever loved, and that no one will ever love like them ever again, and that no one has ever loved like them ever before. And yet, in this interaction by which two strangers meet each other and somehow retroactively believe that they were meant to be, in other words, that all the contingent accidental events that led to their meeting was somehow necessarily a manifestation of some higher fate, is precisely what fate looks like. In other words, fate for Hegel, like love, isn't a predetermined pathway upon which automata walk and fulfill their destiny. It's that the retroactive realization of fate in what is an otherwise contingent sequence of events is precisely the realization of fate. Similar to Sisyphus, who we have to imagine happy. He's not happy because of the absence of contingent circumstances pushing the boulder up the hill over and over again. He is happy because he realizes and accepts and embraces the necessity of his actions. In other words, they are no longer merely contingent, they are now necessary. And this shift, this perspectival distortion from contingency, accident, to necessity, fate, means that the subject has to enter into the event. The subject has to recognize himself in the call of the other. I see here the grounding, the space for the realization of my own subjectivity. And it's precisely this fall into contingency that allows for the emergence of subjectivity in its highest, i.e. necessary form, which mirrors for Hegel the process by which the fall of God, the absolute, into the lowly, trivial form of the human body made manifest in Christ is how God enters into subjectivity. And so here we see the dialectical unfolding by which subject enters into the godlike by means of embracing necessity, and God falls into the human-like by means of embracing contingency. And this meeting, this cosmic collision, if you will, between the highest as the lowest and the lowest as the highest is what Hegel calls the capital T truth, essentially, spirit. Because spirit is nothing more and nothing less than the truth of the form, not the form itself, but the truth of the form of the relationship between the ideal and the appearance, between essence and appearance. And once you understand the truth of this form, you have therefore ascended into a higher form of knowing, which Hegel calls Vernunft. Reason, capital R reason, which was the challenge that Kant was preoccupied with. Therefore, the night of the world is not the location of this truth, but it is the conceptual site in which the truth of the form as to this higher truth can be found. And of course, here we find again a dialectical or chiasmic image. And this is really important because for Hegel, his writing isn't simply, I'm going to give you the bullet points. It's within the writing, within the form of his writing, we see recreated the very form or argument, the structure of his very position. It's very beautiful in a way, which is to say the subject who quote unquote falls into the night of the world doesn't find himself in the night of the world. It's that in this fall, the horizon of the possibility of as to the recognition of the lack of an a priori from which one falls, therefore retroactively reveals the truth, which is a horribly obtuse statement to make. I apologize. Essentially, what it means for Hegel is that philosophy, like life, is the process by which necessity is realized through contingency, by which essence is revealed as having always already, the Hegelian shibboleth, always already, having been made manifest in that which was supposed to be its antithesis. Or, as I said before, the Hegelian logic can be summed up as the fall retroactively creates that from which it is falling. That is the Hegelian ontology. Thank you guys so much for watching today. I know I included a lot of things here, So please see this as an invitation to participate in more of my classes. I'll be posting more videos to YouTube as well. The goal here is to maintain the complexity of these ideas, but hopefully initiate you into them in a way that will encourage and stimulate your own reading and study. After all, that's the whole point, is because I think it's pleasurable. I think it's enriching and enjoyable to learn about these things. And so hopefully you will see this as an invitation for further learning. If you'd like to join our learning community and download my supplementary learning materials, please consider becoming a patron. That is how I can keep these lectures open access and for free, which means the world to me. So a huge thank you to our patrons. And if you'd like to become a patron, please go to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. On that note, I wish you a lovely weekend, and I will see you next week.